Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to part 2 of my 70 must-read Victorian novels. So if you haven't seen part 1 of this video, please do go back and watch that first. I will leave a link down below in the description, but if you watch this video without having seen that video, I feel like you're missing lots of important context and introductory stuff. In that video, I explained kind of how I came up with this list and what my thinking behind it was, and the ways in which I have tried to be objective and the ways in which I know I have failed, and so on. So please do go and watch that video first, and you will also see the first 35 books I selected for this list. But today we're going to go through the next 35, and hopefully this video will be less ridiculously long than the last one. We will see. So we finished off the previous video with Elizabeth Gaskell, and I'm going to be starting this video with George Gissing, and I've selected 2 of his novels. The first is The Netherworld, which is a really powerful novel set in the slums of London, looking at various characters who are all really at the very, very bottom of society, who are really, really struggling. And we follow a young girl called Jane Snowdon, and what happens when her grandfather leaves her a legacy, hoping that she will use it to improve the lives of those around her. It is a very tragic book in some ways, but it's also so good, so rich, so powerful, so poignant, just so fantastic. But I also couldn't not include The Odd Women, which is George Gissing's New Woman novel, looking at the lives of various unmarried women in late Victorian London, one of whom wants to get married and believes that is kind of the only way out of the poverty that she's in, but some of the other women want to try and do something different with their lives, and we follow 2 women who run a typewriting school where they're trying to educate middle-class girls so that they can go on to have secretarial careers, and this book really looks at the limited options available for women at this point in time in a really powerful way that I just find fascinating. So I would really, really recommend The Odd Women. And talking of New Women novels, the next book on my list is The Beth book by Sarah Grand, which is a fantastic Bildungsroman and feminist new woman novel. The Beth book is all about the character of Beth, how she grows up from her childhood until her adulthood, what it was like to be a girl and woman in the Victorian period. It looks at education and marriage and being a writer and so much more, and you get to see Beth's mind as it develops and grows, and it's just a really fantastic novel that is incredibly worth your time. Genuinely, I feel like Beth is one of the most psychologically complex, well-realised characters you can find in Victorian literature, and the way the novel looks at how she becomes herself over time, it's just great. Next we come to Thomas Hardy. I have been very restrained and limited myself to 3 books on this list, though I have read all of his books and I do love them a lot, but I have gone for 3. I didn't even put Jude the Obscure on this list, and I hope you know that that was hard for me, but I felt that probably on balance it was less of a must-read than these other 3. So first I have Far From the Madding Crowd, which I think is a really good place to start with Thomas Hardy, and I genuinely think it's one of his absolute best. It's got a great love square going on in it, but it's also a fascinating novel in terms of the way it looks at farming, and the history of farming and women's involvement in farming, and I feel like that element of it is something that's hugely worth reading Far From the Madding Crowd for, because you'll learn so much about rural life and the rural economy during the Victorian period. Then I've also put The Woodlanders on this list, which is another really fantastic example of rural life within the Victorian period, but quite a different kind of rural landscape, because while Far From the Madding Crowd is all set around farming and sheep farms, The Woodlanders is all set around forests and forestry, and that is a fascinating element of it. It also looks fascinatingly at social mobility, and how social mobility often caused sort of division between generations. We're following a young woman called Grace Melbury who's kind of been educated above the class that she was born in, and how that affects her relationship with her family, and a young man who she used to want to marry. The Woodlanders is so powerful and so fantastic, and it is one of my favourite Thomas Hardy novels. And then, as I said, I have limited myself to 3, and I decided not to go with Jude the Obscure. I'm now kind of wondering why I didn't decide to go for The Mayor of Casterbridge, which maybe should also be on this list, but then there would be 71 books and I've already written the list, so it's too late. Anyway, we will have as our 3rd Thomas Hardy book Tess of the D'Urbervilles, because although it is not my favourite Thomas Hardy novel, and although there are Thomas Hardy novels I love more, I do recognise its massive importance. Tess of the D'Urbervilles probably remains Thomas Hardy's most famous novel, and I do understand why. It follows the story of Tess, who has an incredibly difficult life, and the way Thomas Hardy looks at the sort of fallen woman question within Victorian society, and calls into questions a lot of assumptions that people held within the Victorian period. That is something that is incredibly important within Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and so I think it's really worth reading as a novel, but it's also really worth reading because of the important and subversive subject matter at the time. Next, a very different book, After London or Wild England by Richard Jefferies, which is a Victorian novel set in a future where industry and civilization has kind of collapsed and things have kind of reverted back to the medieval period. It's not that it's the greatest novel ever written, but it's a fascinating premise, and it's really historically interesting to read a Victorian writer looking at like the collapse of Victorian society. Next up, I have Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, a really important Victorian comic novel about three men who take a trip in a boat and everything goes wrong for them all the time. It's very funny, very silly, and one of those Victorian novels that has remained consistently popular. Next up, we have The Half Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury, a wonderful, fascinating book looking at two half sisters, one of whom is the legitimate daughter of their father, one of whom is the illegitimate daughter. They grow up in very different class backgrounds and go on to have very different lives, and the half sisters uses these two sisters to look at the position of women within the Victorian period. It's powerful, it's moving, it's proto-feminist, it's fascinating, and I really, really recommend it. Next on this list, I have Kim by Rudyard Kipling. I feel like this is a slight fudge because I think the serialization of Kim began during the Victorian period, but I think maybe it only came out in book form just after the Victorian period was over. But some of it was written and published during the Victorian period, and it is a book that reflects upon Victorian attitudes towards empire in a really interesting way. So Kim is set in India and is about a young white boy who has grown up in India and about his experiences. It is a book that is really, really worth a read if you are interested in learning more about the British Empire and how people in Britain in the 19th century thought about the British Empire. Kim is a fascinating novel, and I think it's a really interesting historical artifact. Do go into it prepared for a lot of racist language. As far as I remember, that's mostly in dialogue rather than sort of in the narrative, but it's still very, very in your face in a lot of the novel. Kim is a really complex book, and I think you can learn a lot from it about the British Empire in the late Victorian period. Next, I have two books by J. Sheridan Fanu. The first is Uncle Silas, which is a really fantastic Gothic mystery, Gothic adventure, maybe it would be right to say, with some truly wonderful, creepy moments. It's really fast-paced, really sinister. One of the Victorian books I recommend the most. It also has one of the earliest locked room mysteries in it, so if you're interested in the history of the mystery genre, then Uncle Silas is absolutely worth your time, and it's just an incredible read. Now, is Carmilla technically a novella rather than a novel? How much longer is it than A Christmas Carol? Where did I draw the line? It's fine. I had that debate with myself in the first part of this 2-video series. Anyway, we're going to include Carmilla, which is a really important vampire book. Carmilla tells the story of a young woman called Laura and what happens when another young woman comes to stay in her house, a young woman called Carmilla, who Laura is very drawn to and who may have some supernatural secrets. A lot of people think of Dracula as one of the earliest and founding vampire stories, but actually Carmilla came out 30 years before and in my opinion is a lot better, so go and read Carmilla. It is fantastic. Next, I have two books by Amy Levy, who is a fantastic Victorian writer, very underrated but really worth your time. The first novel I've chosen of hers is The Romance of the Shop, which is the story of a few sisters setting up a photography shop together in late Victorian London. I love the story of this book and I love the characters, but I also find it really historically fascinating, and I think if you're interested in the history of photography or working women, then The Romance of a Shop is really worth a read. But I also wanted to recommend her novel Reuben, Sachs, which is a work of social realism set amongst the kind of middle and upper class Jewish communities in London. Amy Levy herself was Jewish, and Reuben Sachs is a really, really interesting novel for looking at a group of people who don't get looked at as much in Victorian literature, or when they do, often through a very stereotyped way. If you've read even a small amount of Victorian literature, you probably will have encountered some anti-Semitism on the page. It is something that runs through a lot of Victorian literature and that was quite deeply embedded within Victorian society. And so So reading Reuben Sachs is a really interesting counterpoint to that. Next we have The Beetle by Richard Marsh, which is a late Victorian horror novel which came out in the same year as Dracula, actually outsold Dracula, but has really declined in popularity since, although it is the book that inspired the film The Mummy. So it has quite a long cultural legacy, even though it's not read as much now. I personally much prefer The Beetle to Dracula. I think it's a much more interesting story, and I found it incredibly engaging and gripping when I read it a few years ago. It's worth knowing that there is a very sort of imperial lens to it. The Beetle is very much a horror novel that is concerned with things from beyond Britain being other, but it's really historically fascinating to read, as well as being very gripping, and just a really interesting look at late Victorian horror. I really do recommend The Beetle. I think it's a fascinating read. A very different book next is Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau, which is a work of social realism all about gossip and small town life. Deerbrook is from the early Victorian period and looks at two sisters who move to a new town and what happens to them there. There are marriage plots in it, but there's so much else going on, and it really is a book about gossip and sort of small town life, and I just think it's fantastic. Next I have put The Egoist by George Meredith. Now, I must admit that maybe this is an unwise book to put on a list of must-read books, especially as I didn't put Jude the Obscure on because I thought it was too difficult, too emotionally difficult, whereas The Egoist is not too emotionally difficult, but is too technically difficult. This is the most inaccessible, unapproachable Victorian book I have read. The language is very, very difficult. In general, I find Victorian books pretty readable, but The Egoist is not readable. However, I do think it's fantastic. And when you wade through the prose and finally get into it, you will find a really complex proto-feminist novel about the unequal power dynamics between men and women. George Meredith is really fighting hard against the prevailing beliefs about gender roles in his time, and I love The Egoist for that, and I would really recommend it for that. It is a book to read late in your Victorian journey. You know, if you wanted to read all 70 of these books, which you might, but you're probably not going to, I would recommend saving The Egoist till last, because once you've read the other 69 books on this list, I think you'll be ready for The Egoist, but maybe not before then. It's really, really good, but it's really, really difficult to get into. Then next I have two novels by George Moore, who is a late Victorian Irish writer who I find really interesting. So one book of his I want to recommend is Drama in Muslin. This is a social realist novel looking at various young women who are coming out in society in Dublin, their lives, their dilemmas, their position in society. There's a few reasons why I would recommend Drama in Muslin. One is that I think it gives you a really good look into Dublin society. I think if you're someone who is interested in Victorian literature, you will have a pretty good sense of London high society, and seeing how that's contrasted with Dublin high society in Drama in Muslin is fascinating. Also, Drama in Muslin is a very subversive novel in many ways. I feel like I don't want to say more than that, but there are some really interesting, quite scandalous things going on in it, which you may feel surprised to find in a novel from the 1880s. So yeah, I think it's great. But I also wanted to put his novel Esther Waters on this list. Esther Waters is a novel about a servant who gets pregnant after a brief relationship with another servant, and the book is about her life and how difficult she finds it living as an unmarried mother. And I think it's a really interesting book to read alongside books like Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell and Tess the D'Urberville by Thomas Hardy, which I spoke about earlier. It's a book that looks at that sort of fallen woman question within Victorian society, but in a very sort of down-to-earth way. Esther Waters is not a favourite Victorian novel of mine, but I do think it's really worth a read. Then next I have News from Nowhere by William Morris, which is a fascinating socialist utopian novel about a man who has a dream and wakes up in a socialist future where everything is better, and he walks around the world talking to various people about how the world works, and through this novel and this fictional setting, we get to sort of see William Morris's views on socialism. News from Nowhere is fascinating. It's a really interesting look at Victorian ideas about socialism. It's not a very plot-driven story. There isn't really much story to it. It's mostly just the narrator kind of walking around looking at things. I would say it sort of falls into the same category as something like Erehon, which I mentioned in part 1, in that it is a novel, but it doesn't really have a plot. There's a really interesting kind of examination of class and money and artistry and so much more. I think if you're interested in like the history of ideas in the Victorian period, then it's really, really worth a read. Next up, I have Hester by Margaret Oliphant, which is our group read for Victober this year. I've only put one Margaret Oliphant book on this list, which I feel is a mistake, but I have only read Hester, some novellas, and her Carlingford Chronicles, or at least all but one of her Carlingford Chronicles, but I felt a bit divided about putting a book from a series on this list, or like picking which one from that series to put on this list, because it probably wouldn't be the first. So in the end, I decided to just go for Hester. But I do think Margaret Oliphant's a great writer, and I do think there are more books by her to read than just Hester. Anyway, Hester is a fantastic novel about a young woman called Hester who moves to a new place near her relation, Miss Catherine, who is an older woman who runs the family bank. We're following Hester's romantic relationships, but also her tension with Catherine, and how in some ways they dislike each other because they're so similar. It's a really interesting novel looking at the position of women in the late Victorian period, and I just highly, highly recommend it. I think it's a fantastic read. Margaret Oliphant is one of those fantastic Victorian writers who has fallen a little bit out of favour in the 21st century, but was hugely popular during the Victorian period. She was Queen Victoria's favourite author, so there you go. Next, another underrated Victorian female writer. I wanted to mention Charlotte Riddell and her novel A Struggle for Fame. A Struggle for Fame tells the story of two Irish writers, one male, one female, who come from Ireland to London in order to try and make it as writers. And it's a real kind of like takedown of the Victorian publishing industry in a really satisfying way. And it looks quite a lot at the like gender politics of the Victorian publishing industry as well, how much more difficult in some ways it was to make it as a writer, as a woman. And it's just a fantastic, fantastic read. It's a great story with great characters, but also if you're interested in like the history of books and publishing and writing and all of that kind of stuff, then A Struggle for Fame is so worth your time. A very forgotten book, but it's just incredible. Next, I have two books by Robert Louis Stevenson. The first is Treasure Island, and I will admit that I didn't really like Treasure Island myself. I found it quite boring. However, I do admit its importance, so I thought it kind of had to be on this list. I think especially like by all accounts, the way we like view pirates and especially what we think of as like how pirates talk, apparently a lot of that comes from Treasure Island, and it's really like seeped into popular culture. Treasure Island, if you don't know, is a story of a young boy who ends up on a pirate ship in the midst of a battle for treasure, and it should be adventurous and swashbuckling, but somehow I didn't quite gel with it, but I know a lot of people love it, so I think maybe that's just me. However, the other book by Robert Louis Stevenson I wanted to put on this list I do really love, and that is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Is this another one that is probably technically a novella and shouldn't be on this list and is shorter than A Christmas Carol? Should A Christmas Carol be on this list? It's fine. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is another work that has obviously massively seeped into popular culture. You know, the whole idea of Jekyll and Hyde is much sort of better known than the original story, I would say. And so it's quite weird when you read the original book, because it's so hard to avoid this idea in popular culture that you know the twist before it comes. But it is really worth reading the book itself, because it's really, really interesting. And I think there's a lot of complicated ideas to do with class and like concerns about evolution, and so much more going on within Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so it is really worth your time. Next on this list, I have Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, Dracula is another book that I personally don't like very much, but again, I do recognise its importance, and I think it's a really significant novel in terms of the history of vampire fiction, in terms of the history of horror fiction. You know, Dracula is another figure with huge cultural importance, and I also think it's a really interesting novel in terms of the way it's written, because it's all written through various different forms. So we have diary entries, and we have someone talking into a phonograph, is that the right word? Dictaphone. There's lots of different narrative forms used in Dracula, which is something Bram Stoker kind of gets from Wilkie Collins and other authors earlier in the 19th century, but I do think it's quite an interesting novel in its technical setup, I suppose, even though personally I don't love it. And that's okay. Next up, I have Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Thackeray is probably slightly underserved by having only one novel on this list, because he was a very important Victorian novelist, but I have only read two books by him, Vanity Fair and Barry Lyndon. But I didn't think Barry Lyndon was very good, and not in a like, I see its importance but I don't like it way like Dracula, just in a I don't think it's really worth your time way, but Vanity Fair is worth your time and is really interesting. It was published in the 1840s, but it's set in the 1810s during the Napoleonic Wars, and tells the story of a very atypical heroine, Becky Sharp, who is trying to make her way in the world as a kind of social climber, really. And we're following her and all the people around her, and it is fascinating. It's been a long, long time since I read Vanity Fair, but it's a really interesting novel with some really fascinating characters and a really interesting look at a particular point in history. So it is, again, very worth your time. Next, we have two novels by Anthony Trollope. I think I mentioned in the introduction in part one that I had limited myself to two novels by Anthony Trollope, which was very, very hard indeed. But as with Margaret Oliphant, actually, when thinking about Anthony Trollope and his sort of most significant books, or the books I think are the sort of most must-read by him, I kept thinking of his two big series, the Barsetshire Chronicles and the Palaces. But the books I kind of would have wanted to put on from those series were books later on in those series. And then what I'd be really saying is that you have to read the whole series, and then there would be more than 70 novels. And anyway, Anthony Trollope wrote a lot of novels. I have read 42 out of his 47. So narrowing it down to like the two books by him that I most recommend was very difficult, but there are two books by him which are not in series, which for me are the standout novels and his greatest works. So I thought I would just put those two on the list. Although, you know, really I think you should read a lot more Trollope than this, but anyway. So first we have He Knew Who Was Right, which is a story of a young couple and what happens when an argument between them leads to estrangement and separation. It's a really interesting examination of marriage and the breakdown of a marriage within the Victorian period, with really fascinating characterization. There's also a lot of other plot lines going on around the central couple, and those other plot lines are fantastic as well. There's inheritance plot lines, there's love stories, there's discussions of the differences between 19th century England and America, and there's just so much going on in He Knew Who Was Right, and it's all fantastic, and you should just read it. You should. But also you should read The Way We Live Now, which is Anthony Trollope's other masterpiece, and maybe my favourite novel by him when it's not The Small House at Allington, which is number 5 in a series, so we're not putting it in this list. But The Way You Live Now is a big chunky novel about various characters who are all kind of brought together by a fortune. A man called Mr. Melmotte has turned up in London with a lot of money, and everyone wants a bit of that money, and we're following all of the people who are kind of surrounding and circulating Mr. Melmotte, and it's just great. It's just one of those incredible Victorian social critique novels that picks apart Victorian society, that looks at money and class and marriage and respectability and unrequited love and corruption and politics and so much more. It has everything you want in a Victorian novel, and it's just so good. It's so good. What can I say? You must read it. Okay, we are really getting close to the end of this list now. Next, I have a novel by Frances Trollope, the mother of Anthony Trollope. And the book I have chosen by her is Michael Armstrong, the Factory Boy, which is a early Victorian industrial novel looking at a young boy called Michael Armstrong who is working in a factory, but also a lot of other figures surrounding him. And Michael Armstrong, the Factory Boy, is a really interesting novel in its own right, that does some like relatively subversive things, which is quite interesting, but also it was a really important novel in terms of the political landscape of the time, because Michael Armstrong, the Factory Boy, was actually a really important influence on the Factory Acts of the 1840s that changed laws around how long children could work for and what age, etc. So Frances Trollope, writing this social critique novel that brought people's attention to the plight of children working in factories, actually had a massive political impact, which is really cool and really interesting. So that's another reason to read Michael Armstrong. Next, we have some H.G. Wells, and I have picked out 3 novels by H.G. Wells, all of which I think are really worth your time. So I've got 2 of his science fiction books and 1 of his realist works. So of his science fiction, I first have The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is a really fascinating, sinister, creepy novel about a man who is shipwrecked and ends up on an island presided over by the mysterious Dr. Moreau, who is one of the sort of like quintessential mad scientists of literature, and he is doing some sinister experiments. And it's very creepy and tells you quite a lot about Victorian concerns about science and evolution, and so much more. And it's just really, really interesting. But I also had to put on this list The War of the Worlds, which is a novel set in late Victorian Britain about a Martian invasion. The War of the Worlds is not my favourite novel in terms of its story and its characters, but I do think its ideas are fascinating, and I think The War of the Worlds is really interesting to read, both on kind of like its surface level as a story about an alien invasion and what the Victorians would have made of that, but it's also a really interesting book to read as a metaphor about British imperialism. And I think if you read The War of the Worlds through that lens, it's really, really fascinating. And you can see H.G. Wells making a really interesting anti-imperialist critique within this book. However, I did also want to recommend one realist book by H.G. Wells, and that is Love and Mr. Lewisham. Now, in general, I tend to prefer H.G. Wells' realist books. I would say that I find his science fiction like fascinating in terms of its ideas, but usually the characterization is a little bit surface level. And I think that's kind of because he's just focusing on the ideas in those books, whereas like Love and Mr. Lewisham is all about character and class and social mobility and how a particular person feels about his social mobility, and I feel like that's fascinating, and you get the sort of character depth that sometimes you miss in his science fiction. Okay, we have 3 novels left by 3 different authors. First, we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is just, you know, fantastic and really important and really interesting for so many different reasons. This is the story of Dorian Gray, who wants to remain young and beautiful forever, and what happens as he descends into sin and cruelty. And it's just fascinating. It's so gothic, it's so sinister, it's so witty, it's so clever, it's so well written, it's so fascinating. It's just really, really worth your time. Next up, I have East Lynne by Ellen Wood, which is a fantastic Victorian sensation novel. It is in many ways one of those sort of like quintessential Victorian sensation novels. It has murder in, it has adultery and disguises and deceptions and betrayals and twists and turns and so much drama, and it's just great. It's really, really rich and fun and just moves at such a fast pace, and I would really recommend it. And then finally, number 70, the last of my 70 must-read Victorian books, I have The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte Mary Young. I have only read this one book by Charlotte Mary Young. I feel like she's probably an author who, when I have read more by her, if I were to redo this list in 5 years' time with 100 books, there will probably be more by Charlotte Mary Young, but we'll see. Charlotte Mary Young mostly wrote domestic realism, and The Heir of Redcliffe is a kind of family drama looking at a family with a division within it. It has such a rich characterization, and I especially enjoy the sort of sibling relationships within The Heir of Redcliffe. I think they are really well drawn and really interesting. I think if you like books like Little Women or Pride and Prejudice, or those books that have sort of a really close-knit group of siblings, I think you'll really enjoy that element of The Heir of Redcliffe as well. And in general, it's just really worth your time. So there we go, that's it. Over the past 2 videos, I have taken you through 70 Victorian books that I would really highly recommend. As I said, this list is not a be-all and end-all list. Of course it's not. I have tried to be more objective than I usually would, certainly than I would in like a favourites list or just like a recommendations list, but I also am no doubt influenced by my own biases and tastes, and also, as I said, I've limited this list to what I've already read. But hopefully if you're getting into Victorian literature and are kind of looking for what to read next, this list might be a useful resource to go through. So as well as these 2 videos, I will also put the list up separately on my website, and I'll leave a link down to that below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.